A super genetic modification plan capable of destroying the world, 3 thrilling escape journeys, escape and destruction, destruction and rebirth, conspiracy and humanity, how to choose the right path, genetic virus, invite you to break through. Chapter 1. Being a role model. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hello everyone, my name is Han Yubing. Han is Han Fei's Han, and the rain is the rain. What about the ice? The ice of the ice, In the first class of high school, Han Yubing stood on the podium with a blush on his face, lowered his head, and whispered in a low voice. He had a somewhat shy personality, and just looking at these unfamiliar classmates made him feel dizzy and disoriented, not even able to speak fluently. So, after he finished speaking these things, he also stood on top, wanting to say something more, but still stuttered and couldn't say anything. Just like this, there was silence, and the classmates around them looked strangely at the black-clad boy on the stage, chattering and discussing slowly spreading in the classroom. Han Yubing listened to the chattering voices of these people, feeling both angry and somewhat helpless. Who made him so shy, unable to say what he wanted to say, but desperately trying to say it? In the end, he could only remain silent like this. At a certain moment, the words of the teacher came from the side, Han Yubing, please write your name on the blackboard. Your voice may have been too low just now, and some students may not have heard you clearly. That is a young female teacher, wearing a pair of black-framed glasses, not tall, with a cute face, long black hair flowing freely, wearing professional attire as a teacher, looking very beautiful. Seeing Han Yubing turn her head and look over, the female teacher also gave her a slight smile. Originally, Han Yubing was somewhat angry at the teacher for interrupting her for no reason, but seeing her smiling at him, perhaps with goodwill, he was slightly stunned and turned back helplessly, writing his name stroke by stroke. Although written seriously, this crooked font still looks very awkward, just like someone who looks uncomfortable at himself. Then, he walked down the podium with his head down. On the hallway, he vaguely heard someone say, Yubing, why is this rain? Another person replied, that's right, this person's name is really strange. Xia Chong can't speak the language of Bing, how good it is. It's really. Suppressing his anger, he walked back to his desk and fell asleep on it. This first class passed like this. The person in front introduced him as sleeping, while the person in the back introduced him as still sleeping. After a class, apart from hearing the names of a few people next to him introducing each other, he didn't know many people in this class. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He thinks even for a class, after 3 years, he won't know so many people. But she knew about that female teacher because she was the homeroom teacher and taught Chinese. But every time her class, she either used it to sleep or silently looked out the window, and the bustling streets outside the school railing. In fact, except for Chinese, he also does the same in all his other classes. But it's just a familiar face to her. It wasn't until one day, when the homeroom teacher called him to the office to help with moving books, that he found out her name was Ning. The name sounds like a fruit. However, this teacher seems to be very concerned about himself. Every time he finishes his work, he will provide ideological education to Han Yubing. Despite repeatedly agreeing, he still hasn't made any changes in private and still does what he should do. But it seems that this female teacher is becoming more and more concerned about herself, but Han Yubing definitely doesn't think this teacher is interested in her. The reason why she always does this is probably because she doesn't study all day, is clueless, and lacks skills, she thinks so, and spends all day browsing internet cafes. This is true, just to show the teacher's sense of responsibility. Because Han Yubing thinks so, he is also indifferent to this female teacher. Although he sleeps all day, his studies don't seem to be particularly bad. At least he can always maintain a middle level in the class, and that's why the class teacher can't do anything about him. In fact, no matter who the teacher is, he is indifferent to everyone. Even if he has a good relationship with classmates, many of them just respond lightly. Since his parents divorced, he has been accustomed to being alone for so many years, and he doesn't care about having any friends or anything. As a result, many students initially privately said that he was very arrogant, probably a wealthy second generation playboy. However, after understanding that his background was only the son of a small citizen, they naturally ignored him when they met, but often scolded him in their hearts after passing by. Cut, it's just a stinky fart. But Han Yubing had no feelings about it. After 3 years, he didn't make any friends because he was a day student. In the eyes of his classmates, he is nothing more than a problematic student with autism. Because it has been 3 years now, he has hardly stayed with his classmates except for attending classes. He also does not participate in large-scale class activities, and no one sees where he went after the physical education class ends. No one paid attention either. As for whether he has violated discipline or not, and how much discipline he has violated, over the past 3 years, many teachers have actually remained silent and closed their eyes, and no one knows what's going on. But as for where he went, it's actually quite simple. The place where no one goes in the whole school is the 3rd floor of the cafeteria. As for why no one went, it was because there were rumors that it was a haunted place. Many students had died here inexplicably for various reasons in the early days. Although this was already the information age, and according to various data detections, there were no problems, it still caused panic in the school at that time. Even if someone used a machine to dismantle the 3rd layer, no one dared to go, afraid of angering something and causing trouble. Therefore, it has been abandoned here for years. But for Han Yubing, this place is as free as heaven. That place is open and spacious, and there is also a basketball court. Although it has not been moved for many years and has been damaged, Han Yubing doesn't care about these things. Anyway, when he comes here, he can bring the basketball with him, play whatever he wants, lay up whatever he wants, and even dunk the basket. He probably can't reach the basket. And the rest of the time, he usually sits somewhere in a daze, or simply lies on the ground doing push-ups, sitting tens or hundreds of times until he is too tired to get up, and doesn't know what he's venting. Many times, whenever Han Yubing comes to the 3rd floor of the cafeteria, he unconsciously stays for a long time. Even though he brings the electronic watch his father gave him, he forgets to read it. When he goes back, maybe even if he doesn't ring the school bell, it's almost enough. And every time at this time, it's inevitable to be called by the class teacher to do some ideological work. And over time, Han Yubing no longer has an aversion to this female teacher, and even feels a bit moved, because no matter who it is, there are not many who have been teaching you for 3 years that can persist. Therefore, under the guidance of the teacher, Han Yubing naturally actively corrected himself. However, within a few days, he returned to his old state. Even if he corrected for a few days, the teacher was pleased to see it. Chapter 2. The Girl of Sun Internet Cafe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. However, the reason why sleeping in class all day is a better way for the homeroom teacher to provide psychological counseling is that Han Yubing is a true, internet-addicted teenager. Every afternoon after school, Han Yubing would head straight to the internet cafe called Sun, located 100 meters near the school, and then stay there until midnight before returning home. Sometimes I just don't go home and just stay overnight at the internet cafe until the next day. In the first and second years of high school, the teachers didn't even know about Han Yubing's deeds because the internet cafe was only 100 meters away from the school, and every student knew how dangerous it was. Almost every day, disciplined teachers would wander around, and the owner and teachers of the internet cafe were also very familiar. Sometimes, they would even call the teachers to report it. Over time, no students went to this internet cafe. Because once caught by the school, they will face disciplinary action, so they would rather run more than 10 miles to the internet cafe in the city center than take such a big risk. But Han Yubing is different. Since entering high school, he has not paid attention to the rumors circulating in the school and has been surfing the internet in this Sun internet cafe. Perhaps his luck is too good, as he missed the inspection time of the internet cafe owner every time, which allowed him to pass through the first and second years of high school without any danger. Until noon in his third year of high school, Han Yubing still came to this internet cafe as usual, only to find that the old man's internet administrator had been replaced by a young girl, which exposed his behavior. At first, the young girl didn't recognize him until she saw his identification and suddenly woke up in surprise, saying, "Han Yubing." Han Yubing, who was about to walk to the computer desk, suddenly stopped when he heard these words. He turned around and looked at the girl in a pink dress, with her big eyes wide open staring at him, feeling a strange sensation in his heart. But Han Yubing's gaze remained calm from beginning to end, and he replied, "Is there anything wrong?" I saw the young girl slowly approaching, with a smile on her face. She gently extended her slender and fair hand and whispered, "My name is Lu Shi. I am the daughter of the owner of this internet cafe. Because the internet administrator uncle is sick, I took a temporary leave to work as an internet administrator here. I didn't expect to meet you here, classmate Han Yubing." Han Yubing's face was written with a capital question mark, almost blurting out who you are and do I recognize you. However, in the end, he restrained himself, nodded, and shook hands with her briefly. But his feelings in his heart were still very strange. Apart from his mother and sister, this was the third woman's hand he had ever touched in his life, and everyone's feelings were different. It was wonderful. But he didn't say much, waved his hand, and was about to turn on the power. "Hello." Lu Shi shouted loudly, "We are classmates. Why don't you recognize me?" At this point, Han Yubing had already sat at the computer desk, opened the web page, but ignored her. Lu Shi stomped her feet angrily and strode up to Han Yubing, standing with her hands on her hips. However, seeing Han Yubing still unmoved, her little girl's temper couldn't be contained. She had to reach out and turn off his screen. But just as she reached out her hand, she glanced at the screen, but suddenly widened her eyes and froze. In 2050, a nuclear energy leak occurred along the eastern coast of the United States, causing severe nuclear radiation in the eastern waters. In 2073, Okinawa Island in the Red Sun Country achieved the world's first single-city nuclear power supply system, which is expected to change the global power landscape. In 2100, renowned scientist Han Tianhe successfully developed a small-scale nuclear power supply system, enabling every household to fully utilize nuclear energy. In 2132, dozens of scientists, including nuclear energy tycoon Chen Jigua and Han Tianhe, issued a joint statement stating that nuclear radiation research is harmful to humanity and not beneficial, calling for a comprehensive ban on this research. Looking at the rows of news and history related to nuclear weapons on this web page, Lu Shi widened her eyes. Looking at Han Yubing, she was deeply surprised and only said that this guy who seemed to be an internet addict was only looking at these knowledge when he came online. Lu Shi was surprised and said, "Are you just coming online to watch this?" Han Yubing nodded and searched for some knowledge about the internal structure of the nucleus. After accompanying him for a while, Lu Shi finally couldn't bear it anymore and asked, Don't you play games?" "Look," she pointed to the scattered people next to her, "they all play games." "I rarely play games," Han Yubing replied lightly, then took out a USB drive from his pocket, inserted it into the console, clicked on a simulation software, and started operating it. This. Lu Shi was completely stunned, looking at the boy in front of her with skilled operation techniques. She couldn't imagine that this was a problem in the eyes of her teachers and classmates. But she still found it difficult to accept for a moment. This seemingly ordinary guy was actually writing a bunch of formulas that dazzled her. The key was that even if she was in the top few of the class, she couldn't understand many formulas, let alone typing them so fast. Just for a moment, with the click of Han Yubing pressing on the keyboard, a double helix molecular model slowly rotated and appeared. Han Yubing frowned, wondering what he was thinking. "Ah!" exclaimed Lu Shi, "DNA model." Han Yubing suddenly woke up and glanced sideways at the girl next to him. He thought to himself, why hasn't she left for so long? Just rely on what she can understand, but then he thought to himself, anyway, she can't understand. Let her see, it's nothing. He nodded in response. Later on, Han Yubing inputted many formulas, and the model underwent different body transformations. He smiled and thought to himself that this was a bit interesting. One formula can only transform one quantity, and I didn't expect it to form such a big change. And Lu Shirer also became more and more interested when she saw it. Later on, she simply moved over a chair to watch with him. I really don't know where she was interested. Time quietly passes through the changes in these formulas after an unknown amount of time, perhaps feeling tired. Han Yubing stretched lazily but smelled a strong aroma of rice coming from the second floor. He suddenly remembered that he had not eaten lunch yet, so he immediately unplugged his hard drive and left the internet cafe to have lunch. I actually forgot that there was a little girl beside me who was watching her fall asleep and drowsy. Sure, we're here for dinner. Listening only to the magnetic voice coming from upstairs, Lu Shirer opened her eyes. The first thing she did was look at Han Yubing's seat, which was empty. She couldn't help but shake her head and chuckle softly. At this moment, a middle-aged man walked over and saw Lu Shirer just stand up from the chair. He looked at the seat next to him and his face became serious, saying, "Did any classmates come?" Lu Shirer nodded habitually, but immediately shook her head violently, panicking, "Nothing. There's nothing like Dad, just friends." Lu Shirer's father, Lu Gang, carefully stared at his daughter for a while again, and when he saw that her cheeks were slightly red, he understood 7 or 8 things in his heart. But he then gave a gentle smile and said, "Let's eat quickly. After dinner, we should go to school." Chapter 3. The joke is a bit exaggerated. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Since the afternoon when Han Yubing met Lu Shirer at the internet cafe, he was found in the office by the principal for illegally accessing the internet. At that time, I was still in Chinese class when suddenly a sparsely haired head appeared outside the window, which was the teaching director. I saw him reach out and point to Han Yubing sleeping in the corner, shouting, "Excuse me, teacher. Could the students next to me please wake up the person by the window and come to my office?" So Han Yubing walked out in a daze amidst the confusion of teacher Ning and the confusion of his classmates, especially Lu Shirer's pale face. And then for a whole afternoon, Han Yubing stayed in the principal's office without coming back. It wasn't until after school in the afternoon that Han Yubing walked out of the principal's office expressionless, but as soon as he walked out, he ran into Lu Shirer head-on. Lu Shirer's face looked quite haggard, and she was afraid that she had been waiting here for quite some time. Seeing Han Yubing come out, she quickly walked over and said, "Principal, Director of Education. They're not doing much to you, are they?" But Han Yubing just glanced at her and turned back, stepping onto the road leading to the cafeteria. Not long after, Lu Shirer blocked her body in front and said, "Why don't you pay attention to me? Do you think I told the teacher?" Han Yubing turned around and walked towards the cafeteria, but it was getting faster and faster. "Wait a minute, hello." Lu Shirer shouted loudly and quickly followed, saying as she walked, "Believe me, I didn't tell you." Han Yubing simply plugged her ears and ran. Lu Shirer pursed her lips and continued to follow. So, Lu Shirer kept talking about the two of them reaching the entrance of the cafeteria. When Han Yubing suddenly stopped, her voice suddenly stopped. Han Yubing took a deep breath and turned his head. The corners of his expressionless face suddenly curved slightly, and he said, "Are you hungry?" Lu Shirer was taken aback, instinctively shaking her head but nodding fiercely. Han Yubing let out an "oh" sound, spread out his hand, and said, "But I'm not hungry." He then walked 3 steps and 2 steps into the cafeteria. Lu Shirer was momentarily stunned, but after realizing it, she scratched her head and said in confusion, "He's not hungry. Why do he still need to go in?" "Oh, no matter." Lu Shirer stomped her foot again, "Anyway, today I want to wash away my grievances, otherwise I won't be able to look up in front of my classmates in the future. She also walked into the cafeteria. As soon as she entered the cafeteria, a strong aroma of rice wafted over her face. Lu Shirer looked around, but all she saw was the students lining up at the window. Where is his shadow? Perhaps it was intuition. Lu Shirer slowly walked to the left and carefully looked into the crowd. Sure enough, not long after, she saw the figure in black and had already stepped onto the second floor. Hey! Suddenly, she was heavily slapped on the shoulder, and Lu Shirer was startled. When she turned around, she saw a handsome but oily guy looking at her with a smile on his face. Shirer, haven't you eaten yet? Let's go, I'll treat you to this meal. The person finished speaking and went to grab her hand. Hee, forget it, I still have something to do. Seeing that the person was actually Gao Shuai, the son of the chairman of L City Peace Group, who claimed to be Gao Fushuai, Lu Shirer stubbornly suppressed her verbal abuse and could only reply with a dry smile. Then, regardless of whether Gao Shuai agreed or not, he quickly ran away. Really? Gao Shuai scratched his head. What's wrong with my classmates having dinner? What's so urgent? However, this girl is quite beautiful and has a hot personality, which I like. Gao Shuai looked at her beautiful figure and chuckled to himself before turning around and leaving. Anyway, as a freshman, there will be plenty of time in the future. He still doesn't believe in this high school and the girls he can't catch up with. When she ran up to the second floor of the cafeteria, she found that there was no one here anymore. It was strange to say that although it was lunchtime, there was not a single person coming to the gym to exercise. Now, in such a spacious place, there were only her and Han Yubing left. But just as she was panting and climbing up the corner of the stairs, looking around, she found that Han Yubing was once again standing at the staircase entrance. Then she saw his figure and disappeared. Lu Shirer's heart pounded with fear as she thought to herself that this person was going to the haunted house on the third floor. To be honest, although she has never been to this haunted house, she has also heard many stories about it, such as the strange death of a student or teacher, or the black blood stains for no reason. There are many more, but she is already very afraid just because someone has died in this house. But after thinking for a moment, she restrained her fear and slowly walked towards the third staircase. Anyway, there was Han Yubing ahead. Since he could come, why couldn't she? Finally, she had walked to the wall next to the staircase, slowly extending her head and looking towards the stairs. I saw that the space at the staircase looked a bit dim, with dust all over the handrails. Looking aside, I saw Han Yubing standing on the highest staircase, facing the wooden door in front of him, motionless for a long time. Ha! Lu Shirer breathed a sigh of relief and thought to herself, it seems that this guy is indeed timid. He will not go to this third layer no matter what. She really guessed it right. This guy deliberately hid here to avoid her, but she didn't expect her stubborn personality to catch up. Now that he has reached a dead end, let's see how he can still escape. Hey! Listen to me. Lu Shirer covered her mouth and smiled. Even if you're trying to avoid me, you don't need to do this, do you? Besides, I really don't know why the teacher would know about you coming to my internet cafe. You should believe me, right? Han Yubing still faced the wooden door in front of him, without any movement for a long time. After a while, Lu Shirer couldn't help but feel angry when she saw him still looking so sullen. She scolded angrily, "Speak up." But in the following scene, her mind became blank. After what happened, the young man in front of her left an indelible impression on her. I saw Han Yubing slowly turn around and give a strange smile to Lu Shirer, then without hesitation, step into the third layer. He didn't know how Lu Shirer felt when she saw this scene, but he knew that she never looked for him again for a long time to come. Han Yubing tilted her head more than once in class and thought, is this joke a bit too big? He has also thought about apologizing to Lu Shirer many times, but every time she sees him, she immediately hides far away, making him laugh and cry uncontrollably. Chapter 4 Brain mutation experiment in white mice. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. In fact, the reason why Han Yubing went to the third floor of the cafeteria is not only to avoid Lu Shi, but also because he discovered a secret passage, actually a ventilation pipe, on this floor a few days ago. Walking straight through this passage, he can directly reach the back door of the school and then walk back to his home, which is less than 300 meters away from the school. Compared to going through the academic affairs office, library, and dormitory area at the back door, this passage is much more convenient. Han Yubing's home, like most people, is located in a residential building. However, his building has only 5 floors and no stairs. His home is also on the 5th floor, so many days when he climbs home, he is already tired like a little dog. It was afternoon when school was over again. Han Yubing returned home, took out the key to unlock the door, and walked into the living room. Subconsciously, he glanced at the tea table and saw a note covered by a teacup in the middle. He walked over and brought it over. After reading it, he leaned back and collapsed on the sofa. "Son, father has important work to attend to tonight and can't be with you anymore. There's food in the fridge, please get some mats." Han Yubing rubbed his head and thought to himself, this is the first time my dad hasn't come back. What kind of job has made him so lazy, even ignoring his son? But you didn't agree to come back to accompany me before, luckily I even came back specifically to eat the food you made. Anger came from his heart, and Han Yubing stood up immediately. He picked up the cup and was about to throw it off, but his hand stopped abruptly in mid-air. He touched the cup, put it back, and sighed repeatedly, thanking himself for having strong self-control, otherwise my dad would have been scolded again when he came back. Taking out milk and bread from the refrigerator, Han Yubing spread them on the sofa, turned on the TV, and watched the news while eating. Perhaps he was too tired, but after finishing the meal, he quickly fell asleep with his head up. In his dream, he murmured softly, "Dad, Mom, don't leave me." The nuclear laboratory, built on the outskirts of the suburbs, appears to be just a small wooden house, but in reality, most areas are built underground. Extending down 500 meters from the surface passage and reaching the end, one can truly reach the core area of the laboratory. At the end, there are 8 channels leading to various places, each with a laboratory at the end for conducting various studies. The research content is precisely the nuclear radiation that has long been explicitly prohibited by the government. Because this kind of research violates the law too much, the construction of this nuclear laboratory was also extremely careful. Not only did it penetrate 500 meters underground, but it also built layers of protective barriers around the laboratory, which can be said to be the ultimate safety measure. As for who paid for the manufacturing of this laboratory, even the general manager of this laboratory does not know. They only know that there are layers of connections between them, and the specific details have reached into which big tree of the top management in China. Here are the most elite technology talents and scientific leaders in China, and most of them have gone through layers of screening to ensure that their families are not burdened before being confirmed. This can be considered from the beginning of the establishment of the laboratory. These people have been tirelessly dedicating themselves to research day after day for over a decade. That is to say, they have disappeared from society for over a decade. But among these many scientists, there are still a few who can maintain contact with the outside world year-round. Among them, naturally includes Han Yubing's father, Han Guoli. The reason why he can maintain a special identity is not only due to his expertise in nuclear radiation research, but also because he is the son of Han Tianhe, a leading figure in the field of nuclear power. But although both father and son are experts in nuclear research, their research is very different. For example, the study of nuclear radiation was banned by Han Tianhe, which led the country to classify this project as prohibited. As a result, the father and son, who had already had disagreements on the nuclear front, became even more discordant after this policy was implemented. So much so that when Han Yubing's grandfather passed away at the age of 9, only he and his mother went to prepare for his funeral. But Han Yubing knew that a large part of his father's current work of neglecting sleep and food was still related to his grandfather. In laboratory number 7, at this moment, Han Wuli, dressed in a white coat, stood in front of the experimental platform and looked at the small white mouse locked in the cage through the huge transparent glass. He said to the assistant next to him wearing the same mask and white coat, "Shaoli, how are you going?" The assistant named Shaoli nodded and said, "Everything is ready." Immediately after, a huge stereoscopic projection screen appeared on the experimental platform, which read, "The brain DNA molecule detection is ready. The brain DNA gene structure detection is ready. The radiation control center is ready. The physiological activity testing of white mice is ready." Subsequently, next to the lines of text narration, a slowly rotating 3D model of a white mouse was projected. South Korea took a deep breath and said, "Let's start." Shaoli nodded and opened the nuclear radiation control center, then said, "The white mouse experiment number 37 has officially begun. Implement initial radiation intensity of 0.01 millisieverts." South Korea looked inside through the barrier and saw the white mice inside the cage looking left and right. They smelled and smelled here and there, but obviously did not receive any impact. They said, "Increase the control dose. Increase the radiation intensity to 0.05 millisieverts." At this point, both the white mouse and the physiological detection device remained unchanged. Further increase, this time increase a bit more. Increase radiation intensity, 0.2 millisieverts. Finally, the mouse's EEG showed some slight abnormal fluctuations, and its heart rate also increased slightly. However, the body of the white mouse still appears to have no abnormalities. Han Wuli smiled slightly and thought to himself that this time the physical function of the white mouse was actually 5 times stronger than that of an ordinary white mouse. This way, the control of single gene-guided mutations can be much smoother. At this moment, Shaoli asked, "Doctor, which part of the mutation did we have this time?" "Brain medulla oblongata." Shaoli was startled and said, "Brain. But this is too dangerous, and if you're not careful, it could lead to unpredictable mutations." Han Wuli firmly said, "The laboratory has special handling measures, it's okay, this time listen to me." In fact, in the past, South Korea was also a steady person, but this experiment is not insignificant. At the same time, this experimental object is also extremely rare. If most of the problems in the previous 36 failures were due to the experimental object, then this chance of success is rare. Since that's the case, why not go straight to the core and see what kind of mutation the white mouse will undergo? Single wave enhancement to 1 millisievert, target, medulla oblongata. At the moment when the electronic voice fell, the entire laboratory suddenly exploded with a buzzing sound. Although the sound lasted only for 1 second, it completely deafened the 2 people present for half a minute. Within this half minute, both of them looked into the cage at the same time, and saw that the white mouse remained motionless in an instant, with its body stiffening like death. Han Wuli was taken aback and immediately exclaimed in shock, "What's going on? If something really happened, wouldn't it be a complete waste of previous efforts?" But he couldn't hear what he said himself, let alone Shaoli, who was anxiously on the operating system next to him. Half a minute later, their hearing returned to normal. At this moment, Han Wuli, who had been staring at the white mouse, couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief when he saw the white mouse stand up again. Han Wuli turned his gaze to Shaoli, who was sweating profusely at the moment, and said softly, "Don't worry, what just happened?" Shaoli trembled and said, "Just now, the nuclear radiation controller malfunctioned for a full second." South Korea frowned. In theory, the system protection here is at the forefront of the world. If ordinary people want to invade the system, it will take at least hundreds of years, let alone changing an operational item. But if that's not the case, could the malfunction just now still be an accident? "So what's going on now?" asked Han Wuli. "Although it will recover in the next half second." But what? At that moment, the intensity of nuclear radiation skyrocketed to 5 millisieverts. 5 millisieverts. Han Guoli was shocked. If that's not to say that at that moment, the entire gene of the white mouse has been irradiated by nuclear radiation. But Han Guoli suddenly thought that after that, the white mouse did not die, but stood up. Is it that the machine is malfunctioning? No wonder, most animals are probably already dead when exposed to such high levels of radiation, and how could they stand up again? At this moment, Shaoli simply took off his mask, revealing a face that was incredibly beautiful but extremely surprised. He pointed to the cage and exclaimed in surprise, "Doctor! Look!" South Korea looked up and was also surprised, almost collapsing to the ground. The white mouse disappeared under the gaze of the two of them. At the same time, as if sensing something, South Korea looked up and saw a hole the size of a football, which appeared inexplicably above the laboratory, as if it had been forcibly cultivated. Han Guoli touched his hair and felt the crimson blood dripping from the hole. "Doctor, what should we do now?" After a while, Shaoli, who had already turned pale, asked with a bitter face. She knew that this time they had caused a big disaster. Han Guoli suddenly stood up and said seriously, "Anyway, this is also my mistake. I will immediately report to my superiors and try to suppress the situation before it becomes too serious." After speaking, he suddenly opened the cabin door and walked out. But when Han Guoli walked for a while and was convinced that he would never come back, Shaoli suddenly stood up, with a strange curve rising at the corner of his mouth. "Not too serious. I'm afraid from the moment this genetic variant escapes, this incident has reached an irreversible point. At that time, everyone will become a different species. Your experiment will no longer lack materials." She sneered inwardly, then took off her white coat, revealing a black coat, and walked out lightly but confidently. Chapter 5. The Big Sister of Tianhe Hospital. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. De Co Lois Ara Trong Quatrin Lay Text. Chapter 6. Awakening from a Dream and Seeing Only Yufei. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Don't you want to know what my mission to return to China is this time? The woman blinked her eyes and smiled. Han Yubing shook her head and said, "What's not related to me? I'm asking it why." "Forget it, I won't tell you." The woman in black spread out her hand. "What?" But instead of answering, she asked, "So, what's up with you coming here so early?" Han Yubing saw her impatience in her eyes and chuckled twice, "Nothing. Nothing, I'm just casually reading. By the way, have you read the news at 4 a.m.? But after hearing this, the woman fell silent, her gaze wandering what she was thinking. For a long time, Han Yubing said, "Hello." She suddenly looked up and stared at Han Yubing, her gaze revealing an inexplicable emotion in that moment. But this emotion only lasted for a moment before being retracted. But even in just a moment, Han Yubing still sensed this emotion. "You?" he asked tentatively. "You're still a student, right?" suddenly the woman said. Han Yubing nodded and said, "High school is right next to my house." "Really?" the woman seemed to sigh and said, "Target, found it." Han Yubing was taken aback and exclaimed in surprise, "What target?" But at this moment, a white light flashed, and a slender needle burst out from the ring on her finger. With a pop sound, it penetrated through her clothes and pierced his shoulder. Feeling the sudden pain in his shoulder, Han Yubing widened his eyes in disbelief and said, "What are you doing?" But before he could finish speaking, he suddenly lay on the ground, his vision gradually blurring. Vaguely, Han Yubing saw the woman slowly approaching, and a faint voice rang in his ear, "Han Yubing, it's indeed a good name." He closed his eyes and fainted. The gray sky, drizzling with light rain, falls on the endless dark green grassland. Feeling the slight chill on his cheeks, Han Yubing looked up at the sky, but it was filled with dark clouds and gloomy. Suddenly, a row of red dots flew over the sky, and Han Yubing fixed his gaze on them, only to find that those were actually the eyes of a group of mice. Yes, it was indeed a group of mice, with grey pointed teeth and all the characteristics of a mouse, but the pair of huge bone wings appeared so abrupt on their thin and small bodies. Just as Han Yubing was being blinded by these mice, a sound of footsteps suddenly reached his ears. Han Yubing looked forward and saw the middle-aged man in a black suit with a straight figure standing in front of him, looking so majestic. An uncontrollable joy floated on Han Yubing's face as he laughed and shouted, "Dad!" As he spoke, he was about to take steps and walk towards the person. He didn't take a few steps, but he slowly stopped again. "Why are Dad's eyes blood red?" Han Yubing frowned, and at this moment, the person's expression stiffened. Not only did he ignore his call, but the red light in his eyes became even more severe, faintly emitting a bloodthirsty aura. His heart immediately became alert. "You're not Dad." And as if in response to his words, a sudden extremely sharp roar came from under the person's wide mouth, which was so wide that it almost occupied half of his head. At the same time, his entire body was oozing thick blood, and his arms instantly shed blood, leaving only 2 skeletons. In the rest of his body, several tentacles were born, waving wildly. The thing that instantly became non-human roared and ran towards Han Yubing, stretching out all its tentacles, piercing in all directions. "Ah ah ah!" A loud scream of terror suddenly came from Han Yubing. He stood up suddenly, waving his hands wildly. In just a moment, he lifted the desk upside down. Then, he gasped for breath and stared at his feet, motionless for a long time. The entire classroom, which used to be extremely noisy, surprisingly fell silent at this moment. At this moment, the gaze of all the classmates converged on Han Yubing, either with cold eyes or full of questions. But looking at his crazy appearance, for a moment no one dared to speak to him. "Hello." At this moment, Lu Shurer's desk mate patted Lu Shurer and asked, "What's wrong with him?" Lu Shurer also said with a bewildered expression, "I don't know." The tall and handsome person sitting in the front row of the classroom looked at Han Yubing with a contemptuous expression. If it weren't for the fact that there were still a bunch of girls waiting for him to give a lecture, he would have rushed forward and scolded Han Yubing severely. "Who would have bothered me?" For a long time, the person sitting on Han Yubing reached out and pulled his arm, which made Han Yubing suddenly realize that he was in the classroom. Subconsciously, he reached into his clothes and stroked his right arm everywhere, but his entire arm couldn't help feeling no pain, not even a small wound. At this moment, a faint lazy voice came from beside, "Brother, I can't believe. You're really fierce." At this moment, Han Yubing realized that the person who had been sitting next to him earlier was not the sleeping guy from before, but a girl dressed in purple casual clothes. The girl was as fair as jade, with a delicate appearance and a long ponytail. At this moment, she was leaning against the table with one arm, and her agile big eyes were looking at Han Yubing with some playfulness. Then, she opened her mouth slightly and chuckled softly, "Just taking a nap makes the whole classroom boil. I admire you, bro." At this moment, Han Yubing had completely recovered from the fright in his dream. Looking at his younger sister's contemptuous expression, he leaned over and stared at her face, looking left and right, until he saw her sister's heart twitching. He hugged his body tightly and exclaimed in surprise, "What are you doing?" before retracting his gaze. Han Yubing smiled and said, "Yufei, why did you come over? Where's Mom? She shouldn't have come too, right?" Han Yufei spread out her hand and chuckled lightly, "Do you want to know?" Han Yubing quickly nodded. She rolled her eyes and turned her back to him, saying, "I won't tell you." "Hey." Han Yubing quickly patted her shoulder, "Don't do it." "Yufei, I was wrong, can't I? I apologize to you." Han Yufei blinked her eyes and thought to herself that this quirky older brother had even apologized to her. She suddenly smiled and couldn't help but cover her mouth and chuckle lightly. But in order to prevent him from seeing it, she had to endure it. But when she turned around and saw this guy making a face at her, she couldn't help but burst out laughing. Forget it, for the sake of not seeing each other for about 5 years, I'll tell you. Han Yufei shook her finger. This time, I came secretly without telling my mother. Chapter 7. Strange Birds on the Playground. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Upon hearing her arrogant words, Han Yubing couldn't help but squint and said calmly, I don't know you yet. This place is separated from S province by the sea, can you really buy your own ticket to come by boat? Okay, I'm not ashamed to be my brother. You can see all of this, Han Yufei said, her thumbs twirling unconsciously. Then, she hugged Han Yubing fiercely, burying her head in his arms, and a low sobbing sound came into his ear, brother, Mom doesn't want me anymore. And Han Yufei's sudden move made Lu Shur, who happened to turn around and take a quick glance at her, unable to help but be stunned on the spot. Han Yubing was startled and said, what's going on? Tell me clearly, Yufei. Han Yufei sobbed softly for a while before whispering, Mom said she would be back in a few days before going on a business trip, but it has been several weeks and she hasn't even heard from her. Brother, what's going on, Mom? Han Yubing gently patted her back to comfort her and said, it's okay, why doesn't Mom want you? Since you're here, let's stay here for now. When I hear from Mom, I'll personally take you back. Han Yufei raised her head, her watery and pretty eyes covered in red. She gently said, really? So, Dad. Han Yubing smiled gently and said, Dad, you must be very happy to know you're here. Han Yufei wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes and let out a gentle hum. She doesn't even look like a little witch now. Suddenly, a sharp and piercing bell rang throughout the classroom, and all the students quickly returned to their seats. The entire classroom echoed with the friction of benches and tables. Han Yubing took out a string of keys from his pocket and said, Yufei, this is the key to our house. We need to start class now, so you can go back first. I'll cook for you when I get home at noon. By the way, do you still remember the location of your home? Han Yufei nodded, took the key, and murmured, do you remember? Even if you close your eyes, I can walk home. She stood up and finally glanced at Han Yubing before saying, brother, I'm leaving. Then he turned around, left a beautiful ponytail, and walked out of the classroom. Han Yubing shook his head repeatedly, muttering to himself that this woman's mind is really unpredictable, even her sister cannot avoid it. At this moment, a light smile came from the side, and he saw his tall and thin desk mate with a dull expression staring at him with a mischievous smile. He looked at him and smiled, Yubing, who is that beautiful woman from you? She wouldn't be. Fuck you. Han Yubing quickly kicked him away, that's my sister. Kiss her. In math class, it's always interesting. Whether it's the dozing of classmates in front of him, the maple tree outside the window that keeps falling maple leaves, or a cool breeze blowing from outside, all of these make Han Yubing feel so interesting compared to the teacher's lecture. But even though he had never listened to classes, he couldn't help but think a little while looking out the window after facing the bombardment of the middle-aged math teacher's classroom. Thinking about the scenes that happened this morning, he somehow lay one arm on his head and fell asleep in a daze. I slept so soundly this night. Just as he was subconsciously thinking about it, he didn't know which nerve was malfunctioning. With a click, Han Yubing's head tilted and at the same time, his arm slammed against the edge of the table, causing him to scream out loud. Sleeping in a groove. The piercing pain came from his elbow, and Han Yubing cursed inwardly, but could only endure it. But it seems that after he just called out, the whole classroom suddenly quieted down. Han Yubing silently looked up, but in that moment, all his classmates were looking back at him. Including the elderly math teacher. Get up. My desk mate touched his arm. The teacher asked you to answer the question. Han Yubing had to stand up. But he didn't even hear the teacher's name clearly, so how could he answer his question? He had to stand up silently and lower his head under the gaze of the whole class. Time passes by minute by second, although only a minute has actually passed. For Han Yubing, it feels like an hour. Sleep soundly. When the math teacher's words came, the class burst into laughter. Go out and punish the station. But suddenly he knocked on the table again, pointing at Han Yubing and roaring angrily. At this moment, the whole class quieted down again, and most people silently turned their heads back. Only a few dandy guys like Gao Shuai, still looking back with sarcasm. Looking at that guy, he lowered his head like a pug and quietly walked out of the classroom. Really, don't think that if the principal doesn't care about you, you will be lawless. After Han Yubing left, the teacher muttered, he doesn't care, I do. Classmates, do this question like this. Han Yubing climbed on the railing of the corridor, gazing at the street outside the school fence, with a face devoid of joy or sorrow. He never said or cursed anything in his heart from beginning to end, because he knew that this old stereotype had been displeased with bad students like him since the first class, and the reason why he hadn't been punished before was simply that there was no good reason. But as time goes on, the accumulated resentment deepens. Even if it's a trivial matter, he will take the opportunity to pull you out. Han Yubing gave a faint smile. Anyway, he didn't listen to the class himself. It's good to come out and free up his ears while taking some air and enjoying the scenery. Well, there are a few birds still chirping on the tree. But Han Yubing took a closer look, but felt something was wrong. Why are these birds chirping so harshly, and why do they feel like they have so many extra bones one by one, especially the one closest to him? Even his whole body was like a ball of mud, there was no bird-like appearance. Suddenly, a hoarse cry came from the bird at the highest point in the tree. The bird's bright red eyes seemed to emit a dazzling red light in an instant, and a wing flew straight towards the outside of the school. At the same time, a series of hoarse bird calls came one after another, and all the birds on the tree rose from the branches, following the previous bird out. What are these strange birds going to do? Seeing this scene, Han Yubing murmured. Then he crouched down and slowly walked towards the window, revealing his head. Seeing that the math teacher was still talking on his own without paying any attention, he locked his head back and tiptoed down the hallway, following the group of strange birds to the playground. The sky seemed to turn dim yellow when Han Yubing arrived at the playground. On the playground covered in fiery red maple leaves, he held his hands in front of the railing and stared unblinking at the street outside the railing. On the street, there were only a few cars and no pedestrians, except for a bloody jacket in the center of the street that Han Yubing's eyes were looking at. Inside the jacket, there was a bloody corpse emitting a foul odor. And those strange birds, at this moment, gathered in groups on the corpse, tearing off the meat one by one and swallowing it into their stomachs. Chapter 8. Virus Sweeps Schools. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This is really a strange thing. The deserted street, the bitten corpses, and the group of birds that were not like birds were performing such a strange scene in Han Yubing's eyes. Han Yubing's pupils suddenly shrank. To be honest, if it weren't for that jacket, he would have almost thought that there was only a puddle of flesh under the clothes, not a person who had been bitten and had no intact parts of his body. What's going on here? Exactly. Han Yubing murmured, from the moment he saw this strange bird to the now empty street that was supposed to be pedestrian everywhere, he felt that everything outside seemed to have undergone a big change. At that moment, various images from the early morning news couldn't help but come to his mind. But suddenly, he seemed to notice something again. He looked up and saw that the body had been bitten by the strange birds, leaving only bones. And the group of strange birds were all looking at him with even redder eyes than before. Looking at the pair of extremely red eyes, Han Yubing felt an indescribable shadow coming from among the birds, making his back suddenly cool. But he didn't move, and those strange birds staring at him also didn't move. This person with many birds is facing each other like this. But for some unknown reason, after a long time, those birds did not choose to attack Han Yubing. Instead, they flew away with wings flapping after the leader's call. This made Han Yubing feel a little relieved, but at the same time, a hint of surprise rose in his heart. After all, at that time, Han Yubing didn't stop running, but his legs were weak and he couldn't run. But after experiencing this, Han Yubing felt some inexplicable confidence in his heart. Suddenly, there were roaring sounds coming from the street again. Han Yubing's heart was not yet relieved, but he quickly lifted it up. He climbed onto the railing, poked his head out, and looked towards the source of the sound. But there was actually a person there. That was a strong man about 2 meters tall, with a strong physique and muscular arms. As he walked slowly, the entire street made a loud roar with every step he took. Han Yubing was surprised, but the reason for his surprise was not due to his muscular figure, but rather because he was naked and covered in blood. Behind him, there was a tentacle-like object about 2 meters long on his back, waving wildly. Especially those extremely red eyes, which contained killing intent and anger, made Han Yubing's heart tremble even more. It's not a human at all, but a living monster. What kind of ghosts are all these? He cursed inwardly, and Han Yubing slowly retreated. He didn't want to be confessed here like this. The current situation is for him to immediately return to the classroom and the principal's office, explain the situation to the teachers and classmates, and then escape from here. Thinking about it, Han Yubing ignored the guy behind him getting closer and ran out of the playground, straight towards the classroom corridor. At the moment when his figure had just disappeared from the sight of the strong man, he came to the railing and stared straight ahead with a pair of non-human red eyes, but also remained motionless. But suddenly a wild beast-like sound roared out from his wide mouth full of fangs. Roar! Subsequently, from the other side of the street, countless people flickered with red light in their eyes and acted like walking corpses. Against the backdrop of the morning sky and red sun, these people are like demons crawling out of hell. What's going on here? When Han Yubing returned to the classroom and saw the scene before him, he murmured inwardly. Looking around, the classroom was already empty, with only a few broken windows, several crooked tables, and a few bloodstains on the ground, confirming what seemed to have happened earlier. Han Yubing breathed a sigh of relief and secretly said that fortunately, his classmates were also the first to notice the anomaly. Despite being injured, no one died. Zhi. But the sudden strange sound from behind the podium immediately changed his mind. He walked towards the source of the sound lightly, feeling extremely alert in his heart. Teacher. And just as he walked up to the podium and saw the person lying behind the podium, he couldn't help but be shocked. I saw the math teacher lying there, but his whole body was covered in blood and flesh, especially his whole face had been torn apart and looked unrecognizable. But judging from the slight fluctuation in his chest, the teacher is still alive. Without saying a word, Han Yubing quickly ran over and lifted the teacher's shoulders, dragging them out. Since the teacher was not dead yet, there was still a chance of survival. The teacher's body was slowly dragged up, leaving a thick bloodstain on the floor, and the strong smell of blood gradually spread. Just as Han Yubing was dragging the teacher to the door, a pair of dazzling red lights suddenly appeared in the corner on the other side of the podium. However, before Han Yubing could be surprised, he saw a gray shadow swoosh towards Han Yubing's door like a string of arrows. How can Han Yubing, an ordinary person, avoid this extraordinary speed? How to hide? But there are always coincidences in everything, and perhaps Han Yubing's underlying consciousness was at fault, causing him to turn his head sharply to the left in that moment, and he happened to avoid the impact of the dark shadow. Bang! A thick pool of black blood exploded on half of Han Yubing's body, and at the same time, Han Yubing uncontrollably hit his head against the wall due to the large amount of body tilt, and his body also hit the table. A strong sense of pain hit his head fiercely, and Han Yubing supported the table, rubbed his head, slowly stood up, and even thought to himself that his mother's neck was cramping. But he didn't even think about it at this moment. If it weren't for that instinctive avoidance, he might not have just had a neck cramp at this moment. What kind of thing is that gray shadow? In his heart, he secretly guessed that Han Yubing suddenly pushed his head, straightened it, and then moved his body. Fortunately, although the pain from that moment earlier was painful, he was not injured yet. Without success, Han Yubing silently turned to look at the teacher. Sure enough, the black blood just now was splattered from the teacher's head. It seemed that even the best doctor in the world could not save him here. Sigh. With a soft sigh and a few words of silence for the teacher, Han Yubing stopped and quickly ran up the stairs, heading straight to the third-floor principal's office. But on the way through several classrooms, he found that there were not many people inside anymore, and the scene was more or less similar to his class, where there were always a few slow-moving ones to explain. Death, like a math teacher, is a situation where the whole body is bitten and there is not a complete part. Is it something like birds and animals? Han Yubing suddenly had this idea in his heart after looking at the dead bodies of more than 10 in a row. But what is that? For some reason, he remembered the strange winged mouse he had seen in the early morning like a dream. Chapter 9. Teacher Ding Ning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The corridor on the third floor of the teaching building is still as spacious as before. In the middle, all the classrooms that Han Yubing passed by were empty, as if at some moment, this teaching building, this school, seemed to be. He was the only one left. Could those teachers have already left? Perhaps they left earlier, or perhaps these orders to leave school were issued by the principal. During the time when this command was issued, even though he was on the playground, he was still in this school, so why didn't he hear it? Han Yubing never believed that it was his ear that was wrong, either because the school was suddenly attacked when he left, or because the teacher deliberately forced him to leave before issuing orders. Thinking of this, Han Yubing quickly shook his head again. What kind of thing is it, and what kind of virtue can it be? Even if the principal said that afternoon he wouldn't punish me for the sake of my father's face, it was impossible for him to take care of himself to this extent. Turning the corner and walking through the middle passage, passing through the library and several offices, Han Yubing finally arrived at the entrance of the principal's office and stopped. Anyway, even if there is no one inside by now, he still needs to open it and take a look. Anyway, if there is no one, he will save his saliva. As he thought, Han Yubing turned his hand and pushed open the wooden door. But before he could blink, he saw a water cup smashed towards his own door. With a loud bang, the water cup hit Han Yubing's nose bridge, bounced far away, and then smashed to the ground. After a while, Han Yubing finally recovered from the sight of stars shining in his eyes. He touched his nose, looked at the slowly emerging blood, frowned, and cursed loudly, "MD, who attacked me?" At this moment, there was some movement at the office desk in the corner. Under Han Yubing's gaze, he saw a small head trembling and poking out from under the table. Seeing this face, Han Yubing, who was originally angry, now became unable to laugh or cry. "I'm sorry, I thought it wasn't a person who came in." At this moment, the figure walked out with an embarrassed expression while speaking. Looking at the person in front of him with a pair of bright eyes full of innocent expressions, Han Yubing chuckled inwardly and said that our homeroom teacher used to have such a little girl. But he didn't show a smile on his face and instead said seriously, "Teacher, why are you here?" Ding Ning nodded and said, "I don't want to either. I was originally planning to replace the physical education class, so I changed into a new outfit. But who knew that my classmates disappeared after coming out of the changing room, and some strange things broke in from the school. In order to avoid them, I came here but couldn't find the school president, so I had to hide here." Looking at her slightly flushed face and the look of her nose bleeding with her head down, perhaps she still had a cute look of guilt in her heart, but she laughed and said, "Don't worry, teacher. I will protect you." As he spoke, he also thought to himself, why didn't he realize that our teacher Ding Ning was so cute before? Perhaps it was the homeroom teacher's phobia that was causing it. Taking the tissue handed by the teacher, Han Yubing wiped off the nosebleed and fortunately, it stopped like this. Suddenly, Ding Ning pinched her nose, frowned lightly, and said, "Han Yubing, what's wrong with the black blood on your body? And how do you want to come here? Han Yubing certainly wouldn't let her know that the blood belonged to the math teacher, fearing it might cause a misunderstanding. So he laughed and said, that black blood sprayed out from a flying mouse. As for coming here, I thought those teachers didn't even know that there was a problem with the school. Ning chuckled and covered her mouth, saying, how could that be? You don't know, those teachers and leaders are all crazy. It's also possible for them to run away on their own before the students retreat. It can be seen that Han Yubing was staring at himself dumbfounded and silent again. Ning suddenly realized that he seemed to have said something more. He immediately lowered his head, his small face red like a ripe apple, and after a while, he whispered, you. Just as I didn't say it before. Han Yubing nodded and let out a sigh. She looked up and down at the woman in front of her, and her shy expression didn't seem like a homeroom teacher. On the contrary, there were more sisters next door. Suddenly, Ning's gaze froze, as if she had thought of something. She looked up and asked, do you think? A flying mouse. Han Yubing was taken aback and said, why, have you seen it before? Ning's eyes rolled as she pondered, But apart from a pair of eyes, that thing doesn't have a very mouse-like physique. Han Yubing's eyes lit up and he said, can you provide a detailed description? Ning shook her head slightly and said, perhaps it happened at that time. I saw that thing diving down from the air and hitting the classroom glass, but its speed was too fast. The only thing I could see clearly was the pair of bone wings. But Han Yubing suddenly lifted his head. But at this moment, Ning's expression became serious. She helped her black-framed glasses and said in a deep voice, at that time, I didn't just see a mouse flying. And this sudden outbreak is likely a biological attack. Han Yubing said, teacher, have you been hiding here all this time and haven't you gone out? Ning quickly shook his head, with a hint of fear in his eyes. Ever since I saw teacher Xiao Wang pierce through his chest with that mouse, I have been hiding here and dare not go out. Han Yubing smiled faintly and said, you don't know, from when I returned to the classroom and almost walked through the entire teaching building, there were no more people in the building except for the dead. Perhaps it was an emergency escape to some place, so. What should we do now? Ning sat on the chair, with a faint sense of helplessness in her eyes, murmuring. Han Yubing's eyes slowly narrowed as he spoke slowly, now we have to leave school first and then look for others. But it's too dangerous outside. What if you? Just as Ning was trying to persuade Han Yubing, a figure suddenly appeared behind him and made her scream out loud. Be careful behind you. A rough voice that did not belong to humans came from behind, but before Han Yubing could look back, the person behind him had already embraced him with their waist and opened their big mouth, revealing their sharp teeth, about to bite his neck. But that person seemed to underestimate Han Yubing's strength. At the moment when the person was about to bite him, Han Yubing threw himself fiercely and threw him off his back, hitting the wall. And Han Yubing didn't talk nonsense either. At the moment the person was thrown out, he had already picked up the stool and was about to throw it at the person's head. Teacher Xiao Wang. But Ning's suspicious cry made Han Yubing stop holding the arm of the bench. Chapter 10. The Beginning of Escape. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ning slowly approached, carefully looked at the person's face, and asked softly. But since that person fell to the ground, he has been keeping his head down, making it difficult for Ning to see his appearance clearly. But at this moment, Han Yubing glanced at the person's hand, which had shed its flesh and blood. Seeing this, he was shocked and suddenly reached out to grab Ning's clothes, pulling her back. Meanwhile, he shouted, be careful. And at that moment, a pair of piercing red lights burst out, shining directly into Ning's eyes. In her sight, she saw a white bone palm, her fingers flashing towards her neck from bottom to top like lightning. Fortunately, at this critical moment, Ding Ning's body was pulled back a bit and she managed to dodge the blow. Otherwise, this blow would inevitably leave deep bloodstains on her neck. Bang! The sound of his head exploding echoed in the room, and thick black blood splattered all over Han Yubing's body. He looked at the motionless body indifferently, smiled indifferently, and put down the stool. Ding Ning was so shocked by the bloody scene that she couldn't speak. After a while, she regained her senses and a slightly angry voice came from her slightly open mouth. Why did you kill him? From the moment the person looked up just now, she had already seen clearly that it must be teacher Xiao Wang. Han Yubing turned around and gave Ding Ning an indifferent glance before turning her head back. Ding Ning, who had just been intimidated by the blood, was once again startled when he looked into Han Yubing's eyes. Why did Yubing just look at me with that kind of lifelike gaze? Ding Ning muttered to herself. For some reason, a hint of grievance suddenly rose in her heart, and her beautiful eyes were already slightly moist. Suppressed sobs softly emanated from her pretty nose. Upon hearing this sound, Han Yubing turned around and saw Ding Ning's appearance. His heart moved, and the anger that had been burning in his heart was gradually extinguished by the tears accumulated in the corners of her eyes. Women are ultimately women, even if they are their own homeroom teachers. Han Yubing let out a sigh in her heart, but her tone remained faint. You already knew that teacher Xiao Wang was dead. What just came in was just a corpse. Although I don't know what happened to this body or why it turned out like this, one thing, teacher, you need to know. Nowadays, in the outside world, such bodies may be everywhere, if your behavior is still the same as before. We will all die with a clear shock from the last sentence. Ding Ning wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes and lightly responded. Let's go down from the teaching building first and see what's going on at the school gate. Han Yubing's mouth curved slightly as he watched the teacher behave so well. Take the wooden stick in the corner and let's go. With a creaking sound, the door was gently pushed open, revealing a pair of eyes. Han Yubing looked left and right, only to find that the corridor was empty before waving his hand slightly and saying, Follow me. Ding Ning responded and followed Han Yubing out. This time, let's take another exit. Han Yubing said softly. When Han Yubing arrived, he went straight up 3 floors from the teaching building in the south, then walked north and passed through the passage between the buildings before finally arriving at the teacher's office area. After coming out of the principal's office, their choice was to continue north, reach the central hall, walk up the central staircase to the first floor, and then exit through the western passage. At this moment, Han Yubing and his companions walked lightly all the way and finally arrived at the central hall. However, looking down from the corridor, no matter which floor of the 3 was empty, there was no one. Han Yubing couldn't help but frown. To be honest, there was no one here. He didn't believe it at all, but he looked around more than 10 times, but still couldn't see a single person. If there is only one person alienated in the entire building, it is indeed a bit strange. Ding Ning stood beside Han Yubing, watching him frown and look down for a long time without saying anything. At present, she can only rely on this student who has always thought she was dull and foolish, but has shown extraordinary calmness. After a while, Han Yubing sighed and said, Let's go. Time passed, and in the blink of an eye, they had already stepped up the stairs and arrived at the lobby on the first floor. However, the hall remained as cold as ever. At this moment, Han Yubing couldn't help but look towards the nearby door, only to realize that the sky outside had become so dim, like night was approaching. The fiery red maple leaves fluttered in the wind, raising one wind after another on the streets, adding a touch of solemnity. You should know that at this time, the sun is hanging high in the sky, and the hour is only noon. Han Yubing and his companions walked slowly to the entrance and looked outside. However, this time the street was no longer empty, and instead scattered corpses were lying everywhere. Along the way, they walked towards the main entrance of the school, with a few strange creatures wearing school uniforms walking like walking corpses, walking in a crooked and disorderly manner. Han Yubing frowned as he saw obvious wheel marks on the street. His gaze extended along the street, and at the corner at the end, a bus stopped there. Looking around, the bus was now emitting black smoke, with dense bloodstains all around it. Half of the body was exposed on a certain window, and there were clumps of corpses on the ground, arranged horizontally and vertically. Han Yubing's pupils shrank, indicating that the bus was still filled with students at that time. However, perhaps due to the invasion of a different species, as the bus was about to rush out of school, some people were actually infected by a different species, leading to a bloody feast inside the bus. And as a result, the bus collided with the wall and came to a stop. Ah! Suddenly, Ning's suppressed screams came from beside, indicating the reason for this scene. Perhaps she also thought of it. Han Yubing turned around and happened to see her pale face. Have all the people inside the car died? Ning whispered, with a faint light gathering in her eyes. Han Yubing knows that the teacher wants to go and have a look with him. Han Yubing shook his head slowly and said, "We're not sure yet, but even if someone survived inside, we can't go and save them. Besides, once we get to the bus and startle those mutants, our first concern will become our own survival." Seeing Ning's gaze dim again, Han Yubing sighed lightly in her heart. Perhaps the teacher was not unaware of the seriousness of the situation, but the kindness in her heart was constantly tormenting her. "But teacher, you don't have to worry too much," Han Yubing said softly. "So far, what we've seen is only this car with dead people. And the whole school is not just this car. Perhaps it was the death of this car that brought the lives of the other vehicles, who knows?" Ning sighed softly, but her face had improved significantly compared to before.